Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. And I fully agree that the pandemic has been terrible in so many ways, but one of the small silver linings is the ability to speak to wider audiences. So what I'm going to talk about is the business case for purpose. So we typically think that purpose is something that companies should do out of moral reasons. But what I like to stress is even if you're a hard-headed businessman or businesswoman, then purpose is something that we want to instill. So it's interesting that I'm coming to this as a professor of finance, why often the finance department of a company is the enemy of purpose because they think, well, it's a waste of money. But I want to show that actually, if purpose is fully consistent with finance and long-term commercial success. And I think a good way to start is just to give you an example and a case study so that you know what I mean when I think about a purposeful company. So I'd like to take you on a journey around the world. So I'd like to take you outside your home offices. Let's imagine you are here. This is the Great Rift Valley. This stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon and Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now you might think it's hard to imagine that you're here because you haven't seen it before. But actually, some of you might have seen it before, not on the small screen of your laptop, but on the big screen of a movie theatre. It was in the famous blockbuster movie, The Constant Gardener. And indeed, millions of people around the world have seen this lake because they've seen this movie. But fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. So when he sold goats, he would receive cash. He'd then have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash and worry about being robbed. And then to bank that cash, he had to walk for 1 day to get to the nearest bank. So Emmanuel's life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats on the greenest pastures. He had to always be within 1 day of a bank. But all of that changed thanks to what I would call a purposeful business. And that business was Vodafone. So in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. And so let me explain what mobile money is, because sometimes we think that it is mobile banking. Well, I have a bank account and I can operate it on my phone rather than going to the branch. But that's not mobile money, because for mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really important because 15 million Kenyans at the time had no access to the banking system. So this completely transformed Emmanuel's life, right? He no longer needs to worry about dealing with cash. He's not concerned about robbery or forgery. He can graze his goats where he wants to. And he also has a record of every transaction on his phone, so his accounting is easy. But we don't want to make just something out of one story. But there was a large-scale study showing that within the first 7 years of founding M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And many of these households were headed by women, so it allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So it had a huge effect on gender parity. So let me now tell you a quite separate story about Vodafone. And this story surrounds tax. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And this is something which is really important to telecoms because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax jurisdictions. So I've got 2 questions for everybody here to think about. So the first is, which of these decisions created value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's corporate social responsibility rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody because I'm pretty sure that most people would agree with the answers. So which decision created more value for society? It was the first one, right? By launching M-Pesa, they lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and also contributed to gender parity. But let's think about the second question. What would have been the outrage if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing, right? You don't get into trouble for not launching an innovation, right? Customers would have never boycotted you because they would have never thought it was even possible to do this crazy idea of banking without a bank. But what is the backlash of not being transparent on tax? It could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone had suffered a nationwide boycott of its stores a couple of years ago. So what is the purpose of me starting with these two different stories? So this is to change our thinking about purpose. Right? We often think about purpose as being do no harm, right? We don't want to cheat on taxes. We don't want to pollute the environment. We don't want to mistreat our workers. And absolutely, right, that is important, right? A responsible business should not do harm. But you already knew that before coming on this webinar. You didn't need me to tell you that responsible businesses should not do bad things. Instead, what I want to do is to change our thinking about responsible business and to say it's much more about the answer to the first question, which is it's about actively doing good. Why? Because I would say that in 2020, given the magnitude of all of the world's problems, it is not enough for a company just to say, we're paying all our taxes and we're not mistreating our workers. Yeah, that's important. But I think a company needs to actively do good. Think about some crazy ideas like launching a mobile money service and be actively contributing through innovation and excellence. So this is a framework that I introduced in a recent book. It is to view the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And we often think that that pie can be given either to investors in the form of profits or society in the form of value. And often we think that purpose is about splitting the pie more fairly. So making sure that investors don't make too much profits, so we might be paying more taxes or paying more wages. And absolutely, right, fairness and a fair split of the pie is important, but that's not everything. And why is this? Well, we can't view purpose as just being about a fair split of the pie for two reasons. First, if purpose means that a company is less profitable, then CEOs might not want to put this into practice. Right? So indeed, we've seen, for example, the Business Roundtable statement being signed by 181 CEOs, but many of them actually don't put it into practice. And you might think, well, why would they? If purpose means that the company is less profitable, then let's not do it. The second reason why purpose can't just be about splitting the pie differently is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people would say, I don't care. Like we often like to think that investors are nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them and society is us. But in fact, that's not the case, right? Because investors are not them, they are us. Right? They involve parents saving for their children's education and pension funds saving for retirement. So any repurposing of business needs to take investors seriously. Yes, it seems sort of nice and will win a lot of votes if we take from investors and give to stakeholders, but we need to also make sure that companies deliver profits to their investors. And so this is why my view of purpose is that it's about growing the pie. So we do want to increase the orange, we do want to serve society, but the way we do that is not by giving a greater share of what's already there, but by actively creating value through innovation and excellence through things such as Vodafone launching M-Pesa. Because the beauty of that is even though the M-Pesa was launched genuinely to solve a social problem, financial inclusion in Kenya, not to make money, ultimately Vodafone was able to monetize it. So what I call this in my recent book is I call it pie economics. Now, you could love or you could hate that phrase, but regardless of whether you like the phrase, let me try to define it. It's about creating profits only through creating value for society. So let me pick apart this definition. So the final four words won't be too surprising, right? Create value for society. You knew that before you invited me on this webinar. But it's the first four words which are more important. We want to create profits through creating value for society because companies need to be profitable. They're not charities. Profit plays a key role in society. But also the important word here is only. Right, there's ways of creating profits by harming society through price gouging customers. So the word only means that we see value creation as the end goal and profits as a byproduct of doing so. Right, so we don't pursue profits directly. Instead, we want to create value for society, and then profits will be achieved if we do this. And so at this point in the talk, you might think, well, everything I say sounds good, but it seems a bit too good to be true. Right, it seems wishful thinking. I'm telling you companies should serve society and then magically profits will appear. And indeed, that's what something was said in the transition between the two sessions is I'm now going to get to, is this actually true? Well, I've told you one nice story about Vodafone, but how do we know that that is just not a handpicked example? So indeed, obviously, my job and many of the jobs of people here who are also professors is to do large-scale rigorous research. And the important thing to highlight is that this research must be very rigorous because of the danger of confirmation bias. So what confirmation bias is the fact that people would like to accept evidence if it confirms what they would like to be true, even if that evidence is flimsy. So there is a lot of belief in responsible business. People would like to believe that if companies are nice and ethical, they'll be more profitable. And the danger is that because people want it to be true, they will latch onto any paper claiming that purpose and profit are intertwined, even if the evidence is not very rigorous. So one of the TED Talks that was referred to that I gave a couple of years ago, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, was about the danger of confirmation bias and how we must be really rigorous with the evidence. And just to give an example of this, let me take an article published in Forbes, which is a very respected outlet. So it was referring to a report which said that companies that excel in their sustainability and responsibility outperform their peers financially. Okay, so they were describing a study. There's nothing wrong with that paragraph, but here's what I think was the problem. That is the premise of a new report, and it is an accurate one, judging by many conversations with those interested in better business, better governance, and a sustainable future. So how did the journalists judge whether the report was accurate? Not by looking at the scientific rigor, not by looking at the quality of the journal it was published in, but just by asking people who believe in responsibility, do you think it's accurate? And obviously they would say it was true. That's because that's what they're predisposed to believing. So I wanted to study this myself, was to look at whether purpose actually leads to profit, and I wanted to do so in a more rigorous way. So this was something I worked on actually from my final year as a PhD student at MIT. So the first thing you need to look at is, well, how do we measure purpose? It's a really difficult thing to measure, right? You can't just look at a company's purpose statement because a company could say nice things and not put it into practice. So I chose to measure how well a company treats its workers. So why did I look at workers, not the environment or customers? It's because I had a very good measure available. And this measure was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, which is published in Fortune magazine every year. So why is this a good measure? It's for two reasons. So first, it was available from 1984, so I had tons of data. That's really important because purpose is a pretty new phenomenon. So many data sources have only been around for the last 10 years. And if I showed you that purpose and profit were linked over the last 10 years, you might be worried because those last 10 years were an economic upswing, right? So maybe purpose only matters when times are good. Maybe right now, when times are difficult, purpose is a luxury and companies should just focus on making profits. So because my data started in 1984, it included things like the financial crisis, like September 11th and the collapse of the internet bubble, and so I could make sure that purpose is something that mattered in bad times as well as good. And the other reason why this was a good data source was that it was very thorough, right? So it looked at not only how much you're paying your workers, but also, are you creating meaningful work? Are you developing their skills? Is this a healthy and vibrant place in terms of working conditions? Now, It's very difficult to, there's a lot of challenges still, because even if I showed that companies which were high on this list delivered high stock returns, why is it causation? Is it that employee satisfaction causes better performance? Or is it the opposite? Is it only once a company is performing well can it indeed start caring about its employees? So I do a lot of work in the paper to get around this. I'm not going to bore you with all of the gory details. I want to get to the bottom line for practitioners. So what did I find after working for 4 years on this study? I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America beat their peers in stock returns by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. And this is huge because what this suggests is that companies that are treating their workers well are not being fluffy companies who are distracted from the bottom line. They're actually being commercially astute. And so what I want to do in the rest of my time before I open it up to questions is to think about, well, what are the implications for you all as practitioners, right? This was an academic study, but what does it mean for executives and investors? So the first thing is it means that purpose is a CEO level issue. Well, I've not used the phrase corporate social responsibility much in this talk. Why? Because CSR has the connotation of being something non-core that you could just delegate to a CSR department. Instead, I'm saying, well, this is something that a CEO and a CFO should take really seriously because it is linked to the bottom line, long-term stock return performance. So it's not something which is just an optional extra or a luxury to pursue when times are good. The second implication is for investors. Right, so when I went to my first socially responsible investing conference in 2007, the investors who were there were not mainstream investors. They're investors that if I was to mention their names, you probably wouldn't have heard of them. They were socially responsible investors whose goal was not just to make money, it was to achieve some social goals, let's say reduce climate impact or improve gender diversity. Now, what has changed over the last 13 years is that this has become really mainstream. So even traditional investors should take this into account. So let's say as an investor, your only goal is to make as much money as possible, which is a legitimate goal. You could be a pension fund wanting to help your pensioners, right? You should still consider these non-financial factors like employee satisfaction because they ultimately become financial in the long term. Okay, and so I'm sure you would have heard of the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, but what my research suggests is that maybe we don't need the word responsible. These are just the principles of investment, right? Any investor should care about how much of a social value that a company is creating because this is something linked to its bottom line performance. Okay, so now we want to think about, well, how do we put it into practice? So I've told you responsibility is important, but well, how do we actually implement it? And so I want to get here to maybe the elephant in the room, the biggest problem that people have with implementing responsibility, which is, well, how do we make decisions, right? How does a CEO know what investments to take and then what investments to turn down? Now, we know how to make decisions if indeed the goal is shareholder value, right? Because we have this big textbook, right? You might know Principles of Corporate Finance by Breeden Myers, and traditionally, like, professors focus on net present value analysis, right? If we want to make a decision, we calculate its net present value. If it's positive, we go ahead. If it's negative, we reject it. That's how to run businesses if shareholder value is the objective. But what if the objective is not just shareholder value, but it is responsibility or purpose? We need to have some other ways of making decisions. And so in my book, I have a chapter which has 3 principles which guide a leader through making these decisions. Now, I only want to go through one of them. I want to allow a time for questions. I already see there's one question. I encourage you to keep adding questions. But for now, right, let me just tell you what I mean by the principle of materiality. Now, to explain what I mean by materiality, let me explain what I mean by purpose to begin with. because I've mentioned it, but I've not formally defined it. So often we think that purpose means altruism, right? A purposeful company is one that is all things to all people. If you look at the red bullet, it seeks to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, communities, and investors. But if you think about it, right, that's not what the word purposeful means, right? Because purposeful means focused and targeted, right? A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So a purposeful company is one that will focus on just a couple of problems and know to do them really well. So you can't try to serve everybody because there will be trade-offs. For example, Engie, the French energy company, thought, do we close down Hazelwood? It's the most polluting plant in the OECD. If we close it down, it's going to be good for the environment, but bad for workers. So if our purpose was to serve workers and the environment, it's not going to help us do this trade-off when there are things that benefit and people then who lose. So this is where materiality comes in. So materiality says there's all these stakeholders that we could be serving, but which are the ones that are first among equals that we're going to focus on? And so what I'm going to show you now is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board's materiality map. So what this does is it goes industry by industry by highlighting what are the most relevant what are the most relevant stakeholders for a given industry. So let's start with the first, which is extractives and minerals processing. So here, the environment really matters because you have a huge impact on it. But what about financials, right? So there's not that big an impact on the environment, at least not directly. Much more material is social capital, right? Because this requires us to be very stringent about customer privacy and data security, and also about selling practices. We don't want to be in a fake bank account situation like Wells Fargo. Okay, so this is going to be the final piece of evidence that I'm going to show. But what this does is this paper takes ESG data from MSCI, which is perhaps the best known data source. And it says, well, if we are to take companies that do well across the board, they do well in every stakeholder dimension, those companies actually don't beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5%, which is statistically insignificant. But then they say, well, if we were to redo this with the materiality lens, we look at companies that do well on the material issues, but also scale back on the immaterial ones. Those actually beat the market by 4.8%. Now it's worth pausing a little bit to highlight the significance of this result, right? Because what it means is that it's better for a company to do well on only a few dimensions than to do well on every dimension, right? So why is that so striking? Well, we often evaluate purpose with a box ticking way, right? The more boxes you tick, if you're good to customers and the environment and employees, you're really good. But actually what this suggests is it's better to be good at only a few things. Well, if one of your colleagues said they were serving on 20 non-profits boards, you might think, well, they're going to have a bit of a time management challenge. But we know this in terms of our own commitments, but yet we expect a company to be committed to everything. And I don't think we should have those expectations. Okay, so finally, let me just talk about what we mean by purpose in the crisis. So we started by talking about some of the silver linings of this crisis. Let me talk about, well, how companies have responded to the crisis. So there are some companies who respond to the crisis in really great ways, which involve splitting the pie differently. So there's some CEOs who are working for nothing. There are some companies who are continuing to pay their workers, even though their workers are furloughed. And there are some companies who are continuing to help customers. So Unilever is giving 100 million euros of food and sanitizer to communities. Now, these are great examples where any company that does that, they should be widely praised because they're giving up part of the pie to give it to society. However, the problem with viewing responsibility as being about pie splitting is not everybody can split the pie. Right, what if You are not in the food and sanitizer industry and you don't have relevant products to give. What if you just don't have 100 million euros lying around? So this is why I started my talk with viewing responsibility as being about growing the pie. Because every company can do that, even if you're a small company and even if you're strapped for cash. So what I think a pie growing leader should ask herself is, what is in my hand? So what are the resources and expertise that my company has, and how can I use them to serve wider society? And so this involves thinking innovatively, like Vodafone, thinking about using their telecoms expertise to solve financial inclusion. So the power of this is that even companies in unrelated industries can help out. Let's take Chelsea Football Club, for example. What can football do to help out in a pandemic? But what is in their hand is they have a hotel. And they're allowing doctors and nurses to stay at that hotel after a day fighting on the front line in the hospital to save them a long commute home. What about large companies hit by the crisis? So let's take Qantas Airways in Australia. Well, they would love to keep paying their workers who are furloughed, but that's just commercially not possible. Why? Because very few people are flying their planes, it just doesn't have money. But what is in their hand is they have a relationship, and that relationship is with Woolworths. So Woolworths is a grocery store, and it used to be that Woolworths would be able to, if you bought groceries at Woolworths, you get air miles and use them for Qantas. And so what they've now done is they've changed that relationship so that if you are furloughed from Qantas, you can get a job at Woolworths and then keep your employment. And what about some small companies? So let me tell you a small company that I'm a customer of. I'm actually going to go there straight after this webinar. It's called Barry's Boot Camp. Right? It's a brutal gym in London. People like David Beckham go to this gym. Now, this gym was closed for many months because of the lockdown. But, well, what is in the hand? It's the ability to run fitness classes. And that, what they did was they ran lots of free fitness classes by Instagram, which had a huge effect because people were self-isolating at home. Now you might think, well, that's not very innovative, right? A fitness company offering fitness classes, albeit online. But here is the great thing, right? What if you're a desk worker at that gym? Right? If you're a desk worker, what can you do? Because these gyms are shut. But what it turns out is that many of these desk workers were actors as their main job. But because if you're an actor, your income is quite volatile, so they took this desk job to provide some income stability. But if you're an actor, what is in your hand is you're really funny. Well, how can that help out in a pandemic? Well, what we had was a lot of people with their children at home because schools were shut. And so what Barry's Bootcamp offered is these free Zoom storytelling sessions for children. And so this took the load off the working parents when they were on a webinar on a difficult business meeting. And so this might be a small thing, but if we think about what are the silver linings from the pandemic? So as we said at the start, it was now we can do these webinars by Zoom. But a second silver lining is that if we rethink our idea of purpose, purpose is not throwing money at a problem, because if so, only large companies can do that. Purpose is about thinking creatively about what is in our hand. How can we think about what can we do to serve society? And that's something that everybody can do, even if you're a small company. And the striking thing is that this is something that even we can do as individual citizens. So one of my friends is a lawyer, and he said to his local coffee store, let me advance purchase 100 coffees from you. So he gave them £300. And then every time he goes in, he just ticks off this coffee card. And that was a way of providing them with a lot of liquidity in a crisis. And so if we think our notion of responsibility is like, we've got great talents and resources, how can we use them to serve society? That I think will be a positive outlook and a positive effect of the crisis. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to allow for questions, but just to say, this was something I released a book about a couple of months ago called Grow the Pie, how great companies deliver both purpose and profit. And the reason why I wanted to write the book was I think for too long, many people have thought that purpose is fluffy, it's an optional extra, it's something which is not really that a serious finance person should care about. But I want to say, no, there's a big business case for purpose here. And this business case is not based on wishful thinking, it's based on a lot of evidence. But a lot of the research is written in academic journals and it's pretty inaccessible to practitioners. So I wanted to translate this to a general audience and to bring it to life with some real world case studies and examples and frameworks for how to put it into practice. So I hope that this might be valuable for anybody who wants to think about implementing purpose within their organizations. Okay, well, thank you so much to everybody for their attention. Again, it's a huge pleasure to be here.